I've got a question to give you a little bit of extra credit, to get a gold star at the end. How many of you know the date of the feast of Saint Stephen? Good. Well, you're a much weaker bunch than the 8 o'clock. But they might have been wrong. A lot of them might have been wrong. Just hold that in suspense. Hold that in suspense for a minute. Because it's Stephen, and I'd like to sort of take a couple of tacks this morning and hope they overlap for you. With St. Stephen, of course, he's mentioned in that passage from the Acts of the Apostles. And these are the types of things that give me a lot of courage as a priest, because I know that imperfect stuff didn't start with me, that it's been there since the beginning in the church. And so if you ever heard of the church complaining, well, who would dare think that? Oh, nobody here's ever complained. Well, it's got some real pedigree to it. Let's go right back to the Acts of the Apostles. Now think of the Acts of the Apostles as the dividing line is basically part B. Luke writes his gospel, and that goes from basically from the conception of Christ, the Annunciation, Jesus' life day, and I'd love to see us be, think of it, every one of you, you got a birthday. But you'd already had 9 months of experience. Tiny, tiny, tiny. Before Mom even knew you were there, you began, and you were who you are. Oh, you've grown bigger, but the core of who you were was already there when you were tiny, tiny. Well, Luke begins with that. And we have that great story of the incarnation, and right to all the stories and the miracles and the teaching and the call of the apostles, and then finally the terrible heartbreak and the mystery of iniquity of Christ's suffering and the passion. And then finally is 40 days. And see, we're edging toward Pentecost right now, because this coming week will mark the 40 days after Easter. It's historically Ascension Thursday, 40 days after Easter Sunday. Then you've got 10 more days to go to Pentecost. So we've got that in mind. They're saying we finally began to get this right. And now you're leaving us again. To complete the loop, the great incarnation, verbum caro factum est et habitavit in nobis, that great unthinkable, that God would come down from his heaven and take on our human flesh, that the flesh may be restored to beauty, our whole bodies. We never separate the soul and the body. We have the two words, but they're both together. That's why the embodied part of our faith is not just an idea, not just my thinking, my whole body. And so Christ took on that flesh. And then we know the story. And then finally, on Ascension Thursday, we celebrate that he completed the loop and returned to the Father. And there are the disciples saying, and we're scared all over again. Now what will happen? Because probably some of you have had that experience. Maybe you lost a great school friend who had to move. Or you lost somebody who died. Or for some other reason, early on we experienced those feelings of loss. And now that the order of the world has just crumbled down around me, what's next? We're going to see some of that timidity in Thomas today. Going back to the Acts of the Apostles, we see that complaining had some deep roots in the faith. Because what was happening there, and it's not hard for us to recognize if you know who the players are, you had the Hellenists, which we might call, the French would call the arrivistes, the newly arrived. You might call it the new money. The newly arrived, it's sort of the establishment looks a little bit askance. Well, what's happening is that those early Christians, they knew that it was consistent with their faith to pay attention to the details. How does this dignity of the human person that Christ has given to all human flesh, how does this play out in the details? Well, partly was with the widows. There was no Social Security. And if you were a widow without a child particularly to take care of you, then what happened? The Roman Empire had nothing for them. And like that with the babies in the womb and with the newborn. The Roman Empire had nothing for them. And so those Christians, those early Christians realized we need to be doing concrete things to recognize this dignity which Christ has given to all flesh. And so from the very beginning, there was the order of widows. And this is where the complaint started, because the newly arrived, the Hellenists, that means from Greece, Hellas, from Greece, and the Hebrews, the Jewish people, that's the establishment, well, they claimed that the Greeks were getting shortchanged in the distribution. And so they called together the group to face a problem in the early church. And on praying, one of the things they realized was that this sacred responsibility needed to be delegated because the apostles had their hands full with what they needed to be doing. And so in their prayer, they created what I guess you could call the first class of deacons. The third level of ordination. The fullness of ordination in the church belongs to the bishop. The oversight of the whole region that we call a diocese. But in a very particular way, it's the bishop who calls to ordination. It's the bishop who ensures, who was designed to ensure that what's in the pipeline is godly, in the training, in the formation. The bishop has that particular responsibility. And then you know us priests, you know what we do. And then in the development of the diaconate again, the deacons do not everything that the priest does, but a number of things, and in a particular way. Pay attention to the distribution, to the details, to the administrator, to much. And what I love about it particularly is, if you notice, there's the laying on of the hands, just like there is for a bishop, just like there is for a priest. For the deacon, there's the laying on of the hands, because what they do, the service, the diakonia, the Greek word for service, what they do is sacred. What they do is no less, and we see it in particular. The reason I ask you to hold in suspense Stephen's feast day is that Stephen is a wonderful illustration. As he was ordained with the laying on of hands, it says right here, they presented these men to the apostles, who prayed and laid hands on them. But we know not long after. So deacons, he's there, but it's much more than serving at table. It's also an evangelist. He tells the story of faith and becomes the church's first martyr. His feast day, December 26th. Oh, you got a head start. Okay, you got a head start. But December, you notice that's not done by accident. That's a theological statement. Simple things like that. That's why our faith is so rich. You can never get to the bottom of this pool. It's so magnificent, so deep. You never get it all. One of my sadnesses is I see Catholics sitting on this treasure, and they think they have to look somewhere else, as opposed to burrowing into the treasure that's there. Well, Stephen's feast is not there by accident. After the glory of Christmas, the martyr's red is worn. Remember of what we offer for Christ, that for Stephen, oh yes, this was more than service. This is his complete life given to Christ. Going over to the gospel there, we're at this point in the church's life, I think, where we're just before Pentecost. So if you can imagine that I can imagine the 12 getting a little edgy, you know, that just like the gospel is taken from the Jesus farewell discourse, this last night on earth before his passion, when he gathers them and he sort of tells all the important parts of the story. Well, we notice the timidity of St. Thomas. Again, you know, we call Thomas the doubting Thomas, who doubted. Well, Thomas is timid. He says, where am I going? He says, Jesus, do not let your hearts be troubled. You have faith in God, have faith also in me, the dwelling places. And then Thomas, the timid one, Master, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? And then later, Master, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And in each case, Jesus calms him. But I sense that how magnificent that is, because by this point, they had been understanding much more than they understood on the eve of the Passion. The resurrected Christ had been with them for these 5 weeks, had brought them to unimagined places with a totally newfound faith. Having tasted that much mercy, life is never the same again. That the merciful Christ had welcomed them rather than say, hey, you bunch of knuckleheads, I'm going to start with a whole new group. He welcomed them in that moment of weakness, and somehow that's what changed them. That's what transformed everything. And now he's about to leave again. He's about to complete the loop, to rejoin the Father again. He won't be with them in the flesh anymore. The Word made flesh and dwelt among us. It won't be dwelling among us anymore. And that's when he says, I will not leave you orphans. Boy, have I remembered that a lot in the course of these years as a priest. He promised, I'm holding you to your word, and I will not leave you orphans. I sense what it was like for those apostles. And now he's given them okay, take this to the world. This isn't just do the right thing and get to heaven. No. This is a gift you need to know how to share. You need to have the words to share it. You need to know what the difficulties are going to be, almost as if you're beginning a sales career. You know, the objections. You need to know what they're going to be. You need to sort of recognize them. You need to be able to work through, because you're going to be bringing this to people who don't have a clue, because you've got a story to tell that is God's gift and designed for every human person ever created. And I sensed those apostles, of course, they didn't have the words. Judaism was not a proselytizing faith. Islam is, Christianity is, but we're the only two. Faiths that are meant to be taken out. And so we're meant to know the words, know how to do that, the stories to tell, how to recognize in the world stories, what's good and what really undermines ours. And I think in a special way of sending children certainly to college, but with big education developing the way it is, I'd be scared to send anywhere. I mean, there's some great stuff going on, but there's also some stuff that can undermine a faith regularly there. And so how do we? And so you're a little bit like the apostles. You're saying, boy, this is a generation, we need to know the stories of faith. We need to be able to tell them. We need to be able to help so they don't walk into school intellectually defenseless. So they don't walk into school intellectually defenseless, because we've got to be realistic enough to know that not everything there is going to support this faith. So that means it's incumbent upon you to do what no generation for a long time before you has had to do. To know how to put this faith into words and recognize the potholes that we come across and know what to say. Of course, you might say, oh my gosh, I am really scared. I wouldn't know where to begin. Well, either did the apostles. That same Thomas, that timid one, you heard his questions. Well, just before COVID started, I happened to be working a cruise that began that flew to Hong Kong and then began in Singapore, to Thailand, across the Arabian Sea, Sri Lanka, India, ended in Dubai, across the Bay of across the Arabian Sea. The first one was the Bay of Bengal. And Christmas Eve, 2019, don't I find myself off the coast of the southernmost tip, at the southern tip of India, Kochi, the state of Kerala, the most Christian part of India. And don't I find that the tour guides say, oh, you're a father. Well, we are Thomas Christians. Because that same Thomas left Syria somewhere around I don't know when, he arrived, he made port at the other end of the world, in the tip of India, in the year 52. Not 1552, 52. 20 years after this, what happened in this gospel. He didn't have the words, but in some ways, the best way to begin this is clueless. To say, God, I'm not ready for this. And I really need you. Not just the words. I really need you. Because I begin to understand I need to know how to do this. And so I'm trusting myself to you. Just don't let me get in your way. I think the apostles were able to do that, and they came up with the words just fine. And so will you. So will you. You may have to begin from clueless, but this way you're going to know you need them. And the world needs the words that you're going to come up with.